watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Back, everybody, on a Saturday evening. How is everyone? Hope y'all all are doing good. We have Father Deacon Anthony Dragani, who's joining me here for a Q&A session, live Q&A session, at the end of the conference that was just presented. If you have not seen it, it is on the YouTube channel. So, obviously, you're watching this YouTube channel, so it's going to be on the same channel, Reason and Theology. If you just go to the videos, you will see a conference that we just aired, a 7-hour conference with 8 different contributors. It's called 2022 RNT Conference, Catholics and Orthodox, what divides us, what still divides us is the theme, where again we had 4 Eastern Orthodox contributors, 4 Eastern Catholic contributors, one of which is my guest here, Father Deacon Anthony Dragani, a Ukrainian Eastern Catholic priest, and we are going to answer any questions that you may have. So go ahead and put them in the chat. Make sure to put them to @Reason and Theology. Father Deacon.
Just to clarify, I'm a deacon.
Yeah, right. In the East, you know, Eastern Catholic deacons are called Father Deacon.
Yes, they are.
Yes, which might be a little confusing to some of the Latin Rite Catholics. So it's a good reminder. But yeah, Father Deacon, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Oh, great. I really enjoyed the conference. It was such a blast to be part of it and to watch it.
I think it went well.
I agree. I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it. There were some interesting moments in the chat
yes,
here and there.
I watched the chat as well. It was definitely entertaining, to put it mildly.
Yeah, at a few points, I kind of felt like this is exactly why we're having the conference.
Yes,
but then
exactly.
There were also others in the live chat that made me feel hopeful.
Yeah, there were some really good comments too. Very insightful.
The internet is a mixed bag. You know, there's some that just. What was the phrase that you use? It's on the internet where the stronghold of the schism persists, or something like it. What was it?
Yeah, I always said the internet is the stronghold of the schism.
Yeah, I feel that that's true with some in the comment section, and then others make me feel like, you know what, we're making some progress here, and that's the intention, is to make progress here, especially between Catholics and Orthodox, so that there would be a lived unity on the local level, on the ground, which will eventually lead to an official unity being declared by the hierarchs.
And I have to say, it was really refreshing from where I'm at to see 4 Orthodox persons on the internet speaking in a way that was very reasonable and desiring progress towards unity. That was very encouraging for me, because unfortunately where I'm at, more often than not, I encounter online the rabid apologist crowd who tend to be anything but reasonable. And hearing those 4 very erudite Orthodox gentlemen expressing their viewpoints was extremely refreshing. And I would love to hear more from them in the future.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd be willing to have them back on. There's a question here from Sean. How exactly would we view each other's saints, especially the controversial ones like Mark of Ephesus and Thomas Aquinas? This is something that came up in the live chat. I mean, there was talk of Photius and Palamas, and of course, some people were very concerned that there is positive talk about maybe Photius, in light of his rehabilitation by Pope John VIII, you know, who restored him to communion with Rome by the authority of St. Peter. So you have that, and some people are just troubled by Eastern Catholics who venerate Photius. So it, of course, sparked a debate in the chat, as to be expected. So yeah, could you maybe comment on that and comment on the 2 individuals mentioned here, Mark of Ephesus and Aquinas?
So here's one way of looking at this.
and hi, Dr. Miner.
Hey.
Dr. Miner will also be joining us here.
Finally.
Hey, sorry, Matthew. Good to see you.
You, Father Deacon.
Always a joy, my friend.
My former professor.
Yeah, I was his professor way back when he was an undergraduate.
Yeah.
Man,
That's
it's awesome
crazy.
Seeing how you turned out, my friend.
Yeah. Someday I'll get. We're not far from each other. We're an hour or 2. I had to make it up to the world of Carpatho-Rusin, you know, centrality up there. So
awesome seeing you in person.
Yeah. So someday we'll find our way to get up.
Yeah,
there.
we're not very far apart at all.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry. That's like we're not
No,
trying.
you're
This is dialogue.
Yeah.
No, you're fine. We're just answering chat questions here. Some of the contributors weren't able to make it, so it might just end up being us. But yeah, Father Deacon, if you wanted to take that question there on the
I
screen.
remember years ago when I was in college, I was reading various saints, both Western and Eastern, and some of them were doing things that were rather extreme. You know, like medieval saints oftentimes were praying for more suffering. Some of them were doing things like, you know, self-flagellation, whatnot. And I remember being troubled by some of the things they were saying and some of the practices they were engaged in. And these were all Catholic saints for the most part. And I spoke with a priest I knew who was very, very wise. And he said to me, people are declared saints because of their devotion to God, their commitment to God. They have an example of commitment that's worth following, but it doesn't mean they're always right. It doesn't mean they're right about everything. And that stuck with me. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. You know, saints are canonized not because what they said was always correct or always right, but because they are an example of commitment to God. So if we look at controversial figures such as Mark of Ephesus or Photius, you know, I would say in both of those cases, those gentlemen thought that they were doing what was right based upon their level of commitment to God. I haven't studied St. Photius very carefully. St. Mark of Ephesus I've studied quite a bit more. And do I agree with his conclusions? No, not all of them. But I do think that he was acting out of sincerity. He really was concerned that in his eyes, the faith was being sold out for material benefit. And that this case was military aid. I think he was very worried about that. That rather than having an actual engagement on theology and working through the problems, they're basically selling it as a commodity for the sake of military assistance. And from his perspective, that alone was unacceptable. So while I disagree with many of his conclusions, I tend to think that he was very sincere. He believed that what he taught, what he advocated was what was handed on to him, you know, from the apostles, and he couldn't stand the fact that it had been shortchanged. So if there were a reunion council, let's say that were to happen, that the Patriarch of Constantinople, certain other Orthodox patriarchs, bishops, Catholic, Orthodox got together, had a reunion council, do you think that if they worked through everything, the final sticking point would be Mark of Ephesus? You know, he must be removed from the calendar or else we will not have reunion with you. I don't think so. I think things like that could easily be worked through. So in that case, I would not be too worked up about it.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Miner, do you have any comments about this?
Yeah, I'll just add something more from the sort of Western side. I mean, you know, normal thing for a Thomist to do is to like drag out Blessed Duns Scotus. But, you know, maybe this will sound surprising. There was a lot in the style of moral theology that Alphonsus of Liguori did that actually it's at least somewhat problematic because of the way he still was in that casuistic tradition. Now, he luckily kind of threaded the needle among all those casuistic issues. But if we were to do moral theology exactly along the lines of his moral theology summa, I mean, moral theology would actually be pretty greatly impoverished. Now, does that, but am I, you know, saying that, am I saying, you know, he was, I'm not calling into question his zeal, his importance in that period of the probabilist debate, you know, et cetera. But, you know, I guess it's just a way of looking at it to say, like, do I agree with all of Alphonsus's conclusions regarding moral theology? And it's, you know, his casuistry is good, but his style of moral theologizing, no, I would never like set up a, you know, if I were in the business, which I'm not, of writing a manual in moral theology or trying to set up a course, which I do, I would never structure it on Alphonsus's overall structure for reasons that are more technical. We could, you know, one could do this, you know, you can do this pulling through. Think about how many of the early fathers are theologically, you know, working through issues, and they have positions that, you know, later theologians then just aren't going to hold, to be honest, because of sophistication kind of precise the points to that. You know, like the Basilian position on differentiation of the sexes, I think, is just Platonism, to be honest. That's, you know, kind of overweening, but okay, fine. Like, I don't care. You know, that's because clearly he was a man animated by zeal, both pastorally and then as a theologian and an orator. So I mean, then you'd have to handle it case by case. But I don't get worked up on Photius. I only teach some stuff on the filioque just in my classical sources class. It's kind of doing something different, but I use it as an example for my students, just of how he's using syllogistic logic to argue on behalf of proper understanding of the order of the persons. And I don't see any issue there, but I'm not as familiar with all the politics of that. But that doesn't really bother me. The Melkites actually celebrate him as a saint. I don't care. Like I use their books, so when I use their books, I do. Even though the Ruthenians, I don't think he's on our calendar.
Yeah. And consider this about St. Photius. If it wasn't for him, there would have been no mission of Saints, Cyril and Methodius. He was the one who really was the impetus behind that whole movement.
Mm-hmm.
So the conversion of the Slavs in that particular wave, a lot of it, he gets a lot of the credit for that, and that can't be overlooked.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. I'm a convert from Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy, but I'm returning to the Byzantine rite in the Catholic Church. Orthodox friends say I'm falling into heresy because Catholics worship a different Trinity. How would you respond to this? Father Deacon, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I would say that the only reason someone would say that we're worshiping a different Trinity is if they are purposely looking to differentiate and create mountains out of molehills. Because the faith that the Catholic Church expresses is the same faith expressed by the Western Fathers and many of the Eastern Fathers throughout the first millennium. And to say that we're worshiping a different God, a different Trinity, is an extreme, gross distortion of what the Catholic teaching is on the Trinity. But one of the contributors, I forget his name, the Greek professor.
Dr. Petros Vasiliadis.
He made a comment that I thought was so insightful, which was in recent decades, there's been kind of a negative orthodoxy, I think is the term he used, a negative orthodoxy, which is orthodoxy that defines itself against Catholicism, that defines itself against the West. And I think individuals who say things such as Catholics are worshiping a different Trinity have very much bought into that way of thinking. And I think that's deeply problematic, because the truth of the matter is anyone who's saying they're worshiping a different Trinity is approaching the question with ill will. I don't think it's misunderstanding. I think it's actual ill will to go that far. But I'll hear what Dr. Minard says on this.
No, I just concur. That's it. I sometimes don't quite know what to say precisely, because you've entered a world where you realize that you don't have the prerequisite for engaging the history honestly, let alone then the current state of the question, which is actually quite conciliatory among parties at an academic level, or even then how in the first millennium it lived, it lived without much being said, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Without a prerequisite, just decent goodwill. I find that's the hardest part of actually these sorts of interactions. We don't have a ton of it, here in exactly where I am in Western Pennsylvania. Just a bunch of Greek Catholics is sort of what it's like day to day. But with my students, because of things that they get, of course, in their own upbringing. Because sometimes this, you'll find this kind of polemic actually within our own churches. I think that's an interesting thing for our Orthodox brethren to remember, is that there are those who are almost anti-Roman within our own churches in union with Rome. So
yeah, unfortunately we encounter that as well, which is a very disturbing thing in and of itself.
Yeah.
But when I was studying philosophy as an undergraduate, our professors had a principle they always emphasized, which is always give a person the best possible interpretation when you're reading their writings.
Mm-hmm.
You always have a hermeneutic of charity.
Yeah.
You assume they're saying things in the best way possible. You don't jump to the conclusion they're saying something that's way off base or even heretical. You don't go there. You begin by giving them the best possible interpretation. This interpretation that sees Catholics and Orthodoxes worshiping different trinities or different understandings of the Trinity is definitely a hermeneutic of suspicion, not of charity. And as Christians, we shouldn't be approaching it that way.
Yeah, it's basically, it's the distinction between what sometimes one will call a steel man argument and a straw man argument. You know, the idea of you re-articulate your opponent in the strongest terms possible, steel manning, instead of, you know, sort of setting up an easy target to push down. And it's somewhat, I will say this, I mean, it's understandable whenever you're, how to put it, whenever you're in a small minority, such as an Eastern Christian would be, in a nation, you know, that doesn't care about you, truth be told, a world that doesn't pay as much attention, right? When people think of ecumenism in the West, they're almost always thinking of Protestant, intra-Western ecumenism. You're going to get into these sort of emotional spaces where you try to differentiate yourself as some sort of anti-fold. So you'll come up with something here where you take one of the kind of historically problematic issues and then turn it into something like this. So, I mean, it's sort of at least humanly understandable, even if it's frustrating from a dialogue perspective. Yeah. But it's hard to answer that question directly, because notice we didn't answer it directly because it's so off base from the facts of the matter, both historically and the state of how even it's talked about today. And then just speculatively, like whenever you look at the best approaches to Trinitarian theology in the West, I mean, you can make the two worlds meet. So.
This is from Jade. Can toll houses in purgatory be reconciled as performing the same function or sanctification?
I'll say no.
Father Deacon, yeah, what do you think?
I would say that, you know, purgatory, as it's properly understood in Catholicism, really comes down to two main points. The first is there's some sort of transition or state of change that occurs, you know, after death, before entering the presence of God, and that praying for people in that state works. It has an effect on them. That's it. That's it. If you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that's what it lays out. Any other speculation about, you know, about purgatory being a place or people there for specific periods of time, or that there's fire, is all speculation. It's not Catholic teaching. You know, years ago, I was working with EWTN doing a Q&A where I'd answer questions on their forums online. And I remember I was sharing an office during that period with an Orthodox priest who was a good friend of mine. We were both PhD students together. And I remember I was writing up, you know, this response explaining the Catholic understanding of purgatory and explaining how it's compatible with Eastern Christianity. And this Orthodox priest was with me as I wrote it. And I remember reading it to him. He said, yeah, that's exactly it. He said, we really believe the same thing here. The terminology may be different, but the belief is the same. And then, you know, I posted this, and then a few weeks later, I see all over the internet, my message was taken out of context, posted on various forums, and it was dragged through the mud by the Orthodox, you know, magisterium of the internet for teaching heresy. You know, one Orthodox priest was saying that my bishop should be contacted because I was a heretic preaching heresy. I mean, it was really nuts. And as I wrote the answer, an Orthodox priest was literally sitting with me reading over my shoulder. So really, on that fact, if we look at it that way, we believe the same thing. Now, the toll houses thing is a whole other story. I look at it this way. For those who aren't familiar with it, toll houses is this theory that when you die, you pass through a series of toll houses in which the soul is tempted or tested by various angelic beings, oftentimes demonic beings. You have to pass through certain toll houses and face certain temptations to make it to heaven. You find some church fathers talking about this, but I always interpreted it that they're talking more figuratively and symbolically than literally. A lot of it lines up, for example, with what we see in the ladder of divine ascent, right? Ever see icons of the ladder of divine ascent? It often shows people, you know, trying to make up each rung, and there are demons trying to pull them down. You know, the toll house theory, as it's laid out in many of the writings of the fathers, really seems to be one way of understanding or imagining the ladder of divine ascent. But I don't think it was really taken literally as being the true, you know, full explanation of what happens between you know, death and, you know, being with God's presence. The fact of the matter is, what happens between death and entering God's presence is still a mystery to us. We know very little about it. We don't really understand it fully. And explanations like purgatory, or, you know, theories such as the toll houses, are ways of trying to grasp something we don't fully understand. But the majority of Orthodoxy never took the toll house theory as being toll house fact. It was just an allegory or one way of viewing things. No one really took it seriously as being Orthodox teaching until Seraphim Rose began to write about it. And again, I love Seraphim Rose. I'm a huge fan of his. I love his books. I disagree with him a lot, but I also agree with him on many things as well. And he kind of took it and ran with it in a more literal fashion. But before him, no one really did that so much. It was pretty rare to find that.
Dr. Minard, any comments here?
Nah, that's
pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I would say even there, it's the canon of trying to even think through that should always be let's stay at least at the level of liturgy, funeral liturgies, penitential stikara and things throughout the year. You should stick closer to that than whatever you're going to take as sort of a second level reading of the fathers, allegorizing something about spiritual interactions here or perhaps in the hereafter with regard to demons. So I've always found it to be a little bit even methodologically misplaced. Like, I don't take it overly seriously, to be honest. It's one of those points of interaction that I haven't even engaged in much for that reason. But I think it actually tries to fill the gaps in too much anyway. I think it's a little bit less respectful of the mystery, to be honest. I think that the like you said, the Catholic position on purgatory is quite minimal. People have stuck in, certain things, even things like the question of the fires of purgatory. That's all accretion. That's accretion on top of what's de fide. So, yeah.
There's interesting one here. Besides Mark of Ephesus, do Western saints like Saint Josaphat prove a roadblock for Orthodox communion with us, or is he disliked simply for his pro-union stance? Father Deacon, what do you think?
Okay, this is a subject I've researched quite a bit in the past. So for those who aren't familiar with this, there are stories that go around. I see them almost every year on the Feast of St. Josaphat, of people posting this belief that St. Josaphat was a murderer who advocated genocide against the Orthodox Christians. And that's become accepted as fact in some Orthodox circles, primarily on the internet, more so than in real life from what I've seen. And, I remember just this past year on the Feast of St. Josaphat, one of my friends posted something about it being the Feast of St. Josaphat, and then Orthodox people started responding, no, he was a murderer, he was a killer. And then some Eastern Catholics jumped in and said the same thing as well, because they were believing the Orthodox sources on the internet. And I wanted to get to the bottom of this and see, is this true? I mean, I'm a deacon in the St. Josaphat eparchy. At my church, we have a relic of St. Josaphat, in the antimension on the altar. We have icons of him. Is he a murderer who advocated murdering Orthodox Christians? Where did this come from? So I decided to get to the bottom of it, and I delved deep. And I looked at a bunch of sources, and from what I could see, this accusation goes back to a letter supposedly written by the Polish chancellor at the time. I know his name. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember it at the moment. Begins with an S, I believe. But at any rate, supposedly he wrote this letter in which he denounced St. Josaphat as being a murderer who advocated for the drowning and stoning and beheading of Orthodox Christians. Strange, right? It gets stranger. Digging deeper, I discovered this same Polish chancellor, again, I believe that was his office. He was a Polish official of some kind. The very same one who wrote this letter that cited as proof that St. Josaphat was a murderer became the primary individual pushing for his canonization after he died. To me, that didn't add up. On one hand, this fellow is supposedly accusing St. Josaphat of being a murderer in a letter. On the other hand, the same fellow becomes the #1 champion for his canonization, who really kind of pushed it after his death. Makes no sense, does it? So I figured I have to see the letter. I have to see the letter. So it's hard. I had to look at a lot of different places. I managed to obtain different, drafts here and there. Nothing authoritative, but I did find multiple places where the letter is cited. I think in Latin and in French. And the versions I looked at of the letter were interesting, because in both versions that I looked at, and again, my French is a little rusty. I haven't studied it since grad school. He was not saying that St. Josaphat did these things. As a matter of fact, in the version that I saw, the way I translated it, he was responding to St. Josaphat, that St. Josaphat was worried that the Orthodox were going to be beheading and stoning and killing Catholics. And the letter was referring to that fear that St. Josaphat had expressed to him. Part of the tone of the letter was that St. Josaphat was being perhaps a little strict in wanting the Orthodox churches shut down, right? And the chancellor was writing to him saying, we can't do that. But then he addressed St. Joseph's fear that unless something was done, there'd be executions or murders of Eastern Catholics, of the Uniates, so to speak. So the various texts I looked at two different ones. In both of them, in neither one was St. Josaphat being accused of being a murderer by this fellow. But this very letter I found translated in English on various extreme Orthodox websites. Not typical mainstream Orthodox websites, but extreme Orthodox websites had English translations of this letter in which they translated it as the chancellor reprimanding Josaphat for murdering people. So my conclusion that I came to was either somebody accidentally mistranslated the letter, or somebody purposely mistranslated the letter to make St. Josaphat be a murderer, posted this on certain websites, and over a period of a couple of decades, it became established fact in much of the online Orthodox world. That's my conclusion.
Wouldn't be the first time I've seen people do that online.
And actually, maybe later on, Dr. Minard and I can talk about this afterward, because my understanding, Dr. Minard, is you're quite good at translating French.
Yeah, I do a lot of French translating. So
yeah, I'm super rusty. I passed a course in grad school and I never used it since, right?
Oh,
so
yeah,
I'm very rusty.
No, I was thinking I'd be more than happy to double check the translation.
I have a whole file full of information on this, so maybe I could send it your way and we could talk about it and maybe get something definitive put together we can put out there to squash this once and for all if you're interested.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add because that was such a learned response. Here's put the dossier together, but yeah, let's get in touch.
Well, here's one for you, Dr. Minard. Is giving people copies of the Pilgrims Way a good thing to do to help Western Christians start to understand Western spirituality? This is a book that has helped me greatly personally.
We're with the man who first assigned it to me, actually. We planted the seed at a distance. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's ever like a single I don't know if there's ever a single sort of way to introduce people, but I think it's such I think it has a gentleness to it that it would be a very good text that would just be easily, accessible. Like my wife jokes with me. She says, I'm not very pious. And yet, it doesn't smack as, being overly saccharine or anything. But I had the course I had with, I want to call you Dr. Dragrani, because that's what I think. I mean, you were actually just finishing your PhD at the time, but it was classics in Catholic spirituality, and you stuck that in as one of the texts, probably because the head of the theology department, Father Tom Hart, would not have minded. He wouldn't have had any mind of that at all.
He was a fan of the East, very much so.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's a fair thing to say. I mean, what would you say if you were trying to just sort of dip someone's toe into? That's the problem. This is like a very univocal thing, right? To say Eastern spirituality. I mean, you're just dipping their toe into one line of hesychasm. I think that's just a good tale to sort of, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I assigned it in that class, and I assigned it in later classes, throughout the years as well, was that it's an engaging story. It's kind of a fun read in some ways, but also it's completely non-polemical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a beautiful example of not just Orthodox spirituality, but the whole Orthodox milieu, the whole Orthodox mindset, without all the polemicism that often you find in Orthodox books. I have friends who are Eastern Catholic, and they find somebody who's interested in Eastern Christian spirituality or theology, very often a new person who's coming to an Eastern Catholic parish, and they say, okay, you want to begin by reading, the Orthodox Church by Metropolitan Callistos Ware, then you want to read this from Meyendorff, then you want to read this from Hopko. All worthwhile sources. I'm a big fan of Metropolitan Callistos, for example, but all the books they're recommending all do a beautiful job of presenting orthodoxy, but also include anti-Catholic polemics. Not necessarily vile anti-Catholic polemics, but still there are arguments in there against Catholicism in favor of orthodoxy. And then these new people who are new to Eastern Catholicism end up becoming Orthodox. I've seen that happen again and again and again and again. And I think that's not a good thing. Personally, I don't think people who are interested in Eastern Catholicism should be reading those books until they're a bit of a foundation first in Eastern Catholicism.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
yeah, go ahead.
Otherwise, I could get confused. But the Way of the Pilgrim, there's nothing in there slightly polemical or confusing in that regard.
Yeah, that you need to, you build up comfort antibodies to then be able to sort of sift through that and understand it. You know, some of it is stuff that we'll say like 90% even we actually agree with, sort of a critique within the house. So you learn how to navigate that, but it has nothing of that. So you can just sort of just that first gentle introduction. I think that it's so much better because, you know, that otherwise you'll what you do is you read yourself then out of Eastern Catholicism very quickly. And that's one of the difficulties of actually, though, being Eastern Catholic. When people say, well, what can you give me that would be a sort of Eastern Catholic, you know, uniquely Eastern and Catholic dogmatics, you know, appreciation. I have a real hard time. Some of the catechetical texts I think are a little bit problematic, or at least they fall short in some ways. But I mean, they need to be digested basically as well.
Yeah.
So we don't have this. So you have to sort of learn by gentle steps, just to say, well, I'm just going to think in an Orthodox way. I'm going to read Orthodox texts, but I'm going to know how to approach them.
Yes.
And that is,
it takes a while to get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And
have you seen Praestor Pascha?
Oh, yes. That's good.
That's one of the best ones, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's actually gentle because as a catechism, it's short, actually. It's shorter than the Universal Catechism, so it's very easily digestible. And it's good. It kind of just gives you, it's a different schema of the same content. So that just parallel shift of things that hopefully someone, especially if they were Western Catholics, they'll see some of the moves that are made when a catechism structure is then shifted in the way that the Ukrainian church did for that. That's, yes, of the catechetical text, that is the one to be recommended. Some of those other ones that float around, I've got, generation older, I've got mixed feelings about.
This is one about Peter and James. I've heard some Orthodox believe that Jesus, or that St. James is actually above St. Peter. Was St. James in a higher place of authority than St. Peter? We'll go with Father Deacon Dragani first. What do you think here?
No. Specifically because, Jesus spoke to Simon and says to Simon, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." We're looking specifically at Jesus, talking to Simon, explicitly changing his name to Peter, rock, and then saying he is the rock upon which he'll build his church. I think that interaction, trumps other things. Even if, James was the brother of the Lord, stepbrother or a relative of some kind, I do think that Jesus's talk to Peter about this trumps that.
Dr. Minard, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I mean, okay, so what's the truth that's parasitic on? I mean, yes, the Jerusalem church had a special place that comes through in the Pauline corpus, but just because of the Church of Jerusalem had that special place, and even then historically has its role in development of certain liturgical traditions, I mean, it's kind of not a comparable bit of reference to the explicit statements of our Lord regarding Peter.
Here's a curious one. If we baptize infants, can we argue that they can receive the Eucharist in the West? What do you think, Dr. Minard?
Wait, Western baptism?
So this is a Western question. If you baptize an infant in the West, can you give him communion?
Let me raise a question. So, I don't know, Father Deacon, how much you follow my stuff. I'm still very Western in training, so like someone listening to me, I confuse people sometimes because I've had students, I'm doing some teaching at Holy Apostles online, and I'm doing a thesis or getting ready next semester to do one. And we're talking, and at a certain point he said, "Aren't you a Thomist?" And it was probably because the Eastern side of my soul was showing, like my comfort with certain themes and especially ecclesiological things and some stuff about the sacraments. But on the other hand, people could listen to me and be like, you're just a Thomist. I've been reflecting on this because I've recently had the bad experience of my youngest child being denied communion in traditionalist churches. I mean, when we've gone and we've been careful and we've explained to them about, that I've just asked about host sizes and things of that sort, because we know what she can receive. She's 2.5, very used to it, because my wife occasionally takes her to the traditional Latin Mass. And there's a scrupulosity about fractioning hosts, which is part of the issue. But it just came up in too many times that I got a little bit hot under the collar. And so I'm going to change this to you, because I've heard, of course, in some of our Eastern Brethren circles, there's a kind of polemic around this of like, look at you denying food to your children. And I usually would roll my eyes. And when it became personal like that, I felt in my soul a sort of almost disdain for the Western practice, I'll be honest, because I got so mad at the fact that their canonical rite was not followed. And I said, well, this is all just, it shouldn't even be this way because of the way that the sacraments have been split up. And so like when I'm in a kind mode, I sort of just say about the development of how chrismation separated off because of the decisions around the minister of it. And you know what I mean? I avoid the issue. I'm entering a place of soul right now where I think that it's terrible that, you're not receiving, because it's such a wonderful thing. Like my youngest daughter this week, I thought she was sleeping on my shoulder while I was cantering. And I went up, we went through, there were just 2 people at daily. Our priest is Ukrainian, and so he usually does just daily liturgy. We're not doing divine praises during the week. And so I go up, we receive communion, and she chirps when she saw the last person. She said, I want to receive. It's like so beautiful to me. And so now I'm looking at the Western practice, and I kind of start to think, why would you tie up, not being in touch with our Lord in this way that is the source of all grace until some arbitrary date? I haven't engaged in the polemics because I used to not care. And all of a sudden I'm in a place where I want to be polemical, and then I avoid it and I go back and do my other academic stuff. So that's my circling way of saying, so what do you think? How do you deal with this discrepancy? Because I really think that it's actually, the Western practice, I think, is objectively worse. I'll even just say that publicly. So you don't have to okay that.
I'm going to be a bit more political here.
Okay. That's fine. I mean,
yeah.
I don't do this very often. Like I'm not known for being that kind of polemically Eastern. So this is a very rare thing for me to say.
Yeah.
I'm kind of in a hurt dad mode. So
what I would say is, emotionally, I am sympathetic with what you're saying. I'm not going to take it upon myself to tell the West what to do, whether their practice is worse or better than ours. But what I would say is, historically, infant communion was the norm in the West for quite a long time, in some places up to 1,000 years. Even longer than that. It's been a while since I've researched this, but Michael, you may remember we did a show on infant communion like a year and a half ago.
I do.
And for that episode, I did a lot of research and reading, and I found that in some places, infant communion and then, confirmation before communion for children was the norm until like the 1200s, 1300s in some places.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the grand scheme of things, the current Western practice is more of the innovation. Would there be a problem with them going back to the older practice of infant communion? Theologically, definitely not. Whatever reason, they're kind of, comfortable with where they're at, I guess. But what I would say is that the Eastern practice is really the older practice of the Universal Church. I'm not saying it's better, but I am saying that you can certainly justify it and then some, right?
That's a nice and political answer. I mean, that's good. It's better to be political like that. I mean,
Yeah,
I work for Roman Catholic College, so I've got to be,
Oh yeah, no, and I really don't think it, but boy, I'm still boiling at traditionalists because of this. Like I've universalized it. I had to go back to my mountain home and just stay alone like a hermit and just let my blood pressure come down.
Yeah, I've never personally experienced this. Part of it is, now that I think about it, not through like intention, but my children have never actually attended a Roman Catholic Mass. Mm-hmm. At some point, I'll take them to one and introduce them to and explain it to them. But where we live, there are Eastern Catholic parishes everywhere. Wherever we go, there are Eastern Catholic parishes. So there was never really a reason to take them to anything but an Eastern Catholic parish.
Yeah, and that's where we were. And there was one, because my wife is still canonically Roman because she still loves the traditional Latin Mass. And in Morgantown, we went to a place where the priest grew up going to Ukrainian church. So he's totally fine giving He's just comfortable with it. So it really is just recently. So I'll be honest, I usually would roll my eyes when I hear these stories, because I'd say, oh, that's so 1950s, what you're saying. And they've had it happen time and time again. I got so mad. I said I felt so bad for my youngest, because she one time she was confused when she didn't receive altar rail. I said, we're not receiving. I said, we're just going to fulfill our obligation. I want nothing else to do with it. I'm in that place. I'm just sharing this in the sense of, because we're not just trying to show what it's like to solve the issue, because we're not going to solve union here. But this is one of these issues that kind of come up, and you can feel like the stranger amid the Western Church. And so
I've heard this same story, Dr. Minard, from multiple Eastern Catholics over the decades. Many Eastern Catholics have told me the very same story. And in every case, it caused confusion to the child, and it caused hurt to the parents. And the fact that there's such widespread ignorance on this, I think, is a problem. The fact that this is still an issue on a regular basis in so many places is troubling. It is troubling, because the actual Catholic understanding is that they can receive in a Roman Catholic parish. That's what I've always been told, at least.
Yeah, no, they actually have a right to. I kind of like canonically into it. And I want to be clear, I've had many good experiences, though. Time. I mean, we for a while there, we hadn't gone for a long time. But I do want to say that lots of Roman Catholic priests, really, it takes them a second, but they flex. As long as you let them know ahead of time, you're not putting them on the spot. I don't want to make it into a major issue, but I just go one step further than your political answer, because I just think from a sacramental theology perspective that, the way that sacramental grace finds its pinnacle in the Eucharist, and it is just food. Food is something you definitely don't have to understand. You just receive from the largesse of the banquet of the Lord. I just think that the ancient practice actually makes more sense, even sort of coherently within sacramental theology. But
theologically, I do think it makes more sense, because the arguments against infant communion are the same arguments that can be made against infant baptism.
Exactly. I said that to my wife. Yeah, my anger. Yeah. So anyway, sorry, that was a long meandering, a bit of emotion. Sorry, folks.
Yeah, I became convinced of paedo communion back when I was still Reformed Presbyterian, because again, the same arguments for paedo baptism is the one for paedo communion. But I remember when my youngest son was baptized in the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, obviously he could receive communion because he was chrismated. But then when I returned to communion with Rome and I go to a local Latin Rite church, they won't give him communion, even though they understand he's been chrismated. So I felt very frustrated with that. I have to drive 4.5 hours away just for my son to receive communion, which he was already receiving when he was Orthodox. It's just kind of odd that I come into communion with Rome and he's not able to receive anymore. It's just, that doesn't sit well. So I totally understand your frustration there, Dr. Minard. This is from Jonathan Talks. Are Eastern Orthodox in spiritual danger? If not, why bother converting them? I get that unity is good, but if Orthodox aren't in a dangerous position, then evangelism loses its meaning. What do you think, Dr. Minard?
Oh, yeah, I mean, sorry, just give me a second to formulate to be appropriately political here. I mean, union is not nothing, because, the status of the teaching authority of any particular church, and even their own jurisdiction, is only strengthened by being being in full communion with the head of the church, the visible church. And so there's a sense in which there is a danger in not being in union. I think we have to actually own that fact, because sometimes we really want to soft sell that. Now, of course, because the weight of tradition and the sacraments, etc., the danger is far less than, in the case of Protestant ecumenism. But, I think that the unity of the church is what the Lord himself wanted. And truth be told, I think that even if I were a Western Catholic, I think the Western Church would actually benefit from reunion with the Orthodox, because they would precisely push the points of pressure about jurisdictional authority of the Pope that actually need to be pressed. And it would actually, in a sense, be of benefit even to the Latin Church and to the Church Universal. But for them as well, I don't know how much you have to ever do moral theology, Father Deacon, but the world of, even though it's much lower in the world of mysteries, the world like bioethics, for instance, is a lot more catch as catch can individual magisterium in the Byzantine world, Whereas, you know, the last 100 years, that's an example of where the papacy was of great use to be able to articulate things clearly without slipping along with the culture. I mean, it's not clear that you have, you know, universal slippages here and there. The classic case is contraception, but, you know, some of the other casuistry, I'd be curious to look into about some of the end of life casuistry and how to contrast them actually. But I think that's a good example of where, you know, having the common teaching authority to address certain modern issues is something that's quite important for the safety of souls, for lack of a better term. So that's a bit of a dance around, because I don't do the I actually don't do the dialogue stuff between, like, on the border that often, because it's just not my strength. But I think that that's at least something of a response. Maybe you can now add and make it more cohesive, Father Deacon.
Yeah, what Dr. Minard said about the moral theology, I think is an actual concern that needs to be addressed, which is, in the Orthodox world, it's very difficult to engage the culture in a way that is consistent. And I've seen this. You know, there are different Orthodox moral theologians, different Orthodox bishops even, who are teaching things that are contradictory. It seems as if one of the struggles of Orthodoxy right now is engaging the modern world and being able to respond to certain moral problems. Because without a unified magisterium, it's hard to do that. It really is.
May add one more topic that you might be able to address too. Another example is like addressing the issues of revelation and development of doctrine. You know, the stuff that the Western world went through at the turn of the century, all the way through the mid 20th century, especially. You know, it faced as a common enterprise under the sort of levels that go up to Rome, the problem of modern epistemology, and especially the issue of development of doctrine. Like, you cannot just talk about that slipshod. People want to think that you can sort of do it quick off the back of your hand and say everything sort of stays the same. It's actually, you can bump into heresy or error theologically so easily in that domain.
Big time. There needs to be a recognition and understanding of the development of doctrine. That is important. If you claim the faith has been passed on unchanged, you know, for 2,000 years, that's a fairy tale, and it puts you in a situation where you're not really able to engage what's going on in the world right now, both theologically and morally. So I do see that as a danger. That being said, for your most Orthodox people in your average Orthodox parish who are following God and living out their spiritual life, for most of them, their spiritual life is no different than that of an Eastern Catholic. And for most of them, they're pursuing holiness, perhaps in a way that's more vigorous than we are, because we tend to be pretty lax about things such as fasting and, you know. So in general, I would say that Orthodox Christians are not in spiritual danger. Many of them are much holier than I am, much holier. I would say that. I think there could be spiritual danger if you have somebody who is Orthodox because they're explicitly rejecting Catholicism. And I've seen that happen. You know, there are people who are Orthodox not because they were born into it, not because they found it and fell in love with the beauty of the tradition, not because they were Protestant and sought, you know, an apostolic church, but they're Orthodox because they're angry at the Catholic Church, or they're anti-Catholic in some way. They hate Pope Francis. They became Orthodox for that reason. That's happened quite a bit lately, I've seen. Or perhaps they're Orthodox because they reject certain Catholic teachings. And if they're there primarily in a spirit of schism, so to speak, if they're there because they're explicitly rejecting, you know, Catholicism, I see that as being potentially spiritually dangerous. And I have encountered people who are there for that reason.
Yeah, and I second what you said. I mean, that's implied. And what I was thinking far more on an institutional level, of course, in my original answer, because on the whole, like you said, you grab someone from the pew. You're finding someone who's going to be at least as devout as someone who's an Eastern Catholic.
Yeah, I mean,
what you show. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead and say it.
Yeah, where I'm at, there's a Ukrainian Orthodox church 10 minutes away from my parish, and their spiritual life is no different than my Ukrainian Catholic parish. And the people there are living the same faith that I'm living. I mean, they'll come to my church. We'll go to their church for different events, and you know, we're separated, sadly, but we're also the same, if you know what I mean. There's no real difference there. But then on the other hand, you encounter so-and-so on the internet, who 5 years ago was an evangelical Protestant, who now has a YouTube channel where they rail against Catholics day and night, right? And slander and lie about people. And, unfortunately, that's more common than not anymore, it seems. And that, I think, is a very spiritually dangerous place to be.
There was somebody asking about whether or not a Latin Rite Catholic could present their infant for communion at an Eastern Catholic church, or if they're concerned that they won't receive properly, they should avoid bringing them. Father Deacon, go ahead and weigh in here.
Okay, so the situation of a Latin Catholic presenting a child for communion, an infant for communion at an Eastern Catholic church, I would not recommend that. Because they need to respect the disciplines of their own church.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Catholic Church is one church, but at the same time, it's a communion of 24 churches, and each church has its own, particular law, its own canon law. And whatever church you belong to, you have to respect the canon law of that church. Otherwise, you're disobeying your bishop, right? And obedience is a virtue, even when it's difficult. So if you're a Latin Catholic and you're visiting an Eastern Catholic church, you should really respect your own church's canonical rules and not present the child for communion. Now, on the issue of Eastern Catholic children not being prepared or not being ready to receive communion, I think that was the question, right? The second part of it?
Right.
Yeah. So regarding that, I will speak from experience. So my oldest daughter, when she was baptized and chrismated, she received First Communion. And for those who are wondering, when you have a little infant, you don't give them the consecrated bread. You usually just give them some of the consecrated wine until they're old enough to eat solid foods. And then at that point, you switch over to the bread. So typically, you'll give them like a little bit of the precious blood on the tongue when they're a baby, when they're an infant. But there was a period with my oldest daughter where all of a sudden, she became unpredictable. I think she was maybe like a year and a half or 2 years old. And we went to give her communion, and she reacted in a way that made us hesitant. And then at home, she began spitting out food all the time. So there was a period there for maybe several months, maybe it was up to a year, where we did not present her for communion simply because we didn't know what she would do. And that was a judgment on our part, not because we oppose infant communion. We absolutely don't. We believe in it very strongly. But during that period of so many months, we were concerned that she would spit it out, because at home things were getting shot across the room from her mouth. But once that calmed down and we were certain she wouldn't do that anymore, we began presenting her for communion again. So I think there's something to be said for holding off on them receiving communion for a period of time if you believe there's a high probability of them not actually receiving it properly. That's a parental judgment.
Yeah, and then a good parallel to that is, like, if you're going to present your child in the Western church, you actually need to know that they can take that style of host. It's your duty as head of domestic church to have either trained them. You need to really be quite aware that they're going to know how to receive in that case. So in both cases, it's the exercise of parental judgment, which seems befitting as part of the grace of marriage in the household. To exercise your ecclesial function that way. And you don't dig your heels in. I mean, it would be insane if you've got a child doing what yours did, to dig your heels in and say, we're Easterners. And so they just receive, because you would so risk, treating the sacrament sacrilegiously. Yeah.
Looking for some other questions. A lot of them aren't really relevant to our discussions, so trying to weed out some of that. I don't know if any of y'all have seen anything in the chat that maybe slipped by that you wanted to grab. Otherwise, we could probably wrap it up here in just a moment. But not seeing any more. Like I said, though, I may have missed. There was an allusion to a question here about whether or not Palimism and Thomism or something that could be reconciled between Catholics and Orthodox. Dr. Minor, would you mind weighing in on this?
Let me make a comment and see what Father Deacon has to say to this, because this is the normal way of getting away with this is to basically to just sort of shift it politically, is to talk in terms of theological schools. But you do often find not just among the online Orthodox, but just, you know, certain ethos, even in certain Palamite scholars, to treat St. Gregory Palamas's thought, partially because of the nature of those councils at the time of the vindication of his doctrine, as being at the level of being de fide as well. Like the distinctions between what Palamism is as a theological school or a theological approach, which actually is even that's a genuine distinction, that even though it's more Western, it does exist even in St. Gregory's thought as well. You know, to speak of what is a theologumenon that's not de fide. Like I said, that's more Western, I'll admit. But like to distinguish between those two layers in him doesn't always happen. And so you can't always say, you know, the shrug that I give. The shrug is, hey, I live with Scotists. My boss is a Scotist. So, you know what I mean? It doesn't always work in this regard, partly because some Orthodox will present Palamite thought not merely in its roots, you know, questions of the nature of the divinizing character of uncreated grace, or even, I guess, what we want to say about, you know, something about the divine operations that at least is somewhat nuancing and different from how the simplicity is handled in the West. That's often treated as de fide. Like they push that, and then they as being not only being de fide, but the whole sort of system then as well. Which is, you know, that's the problem with theology. Theology is always a mixture of de fide truths, which are the illuminating principles of everything you're doing. And then there's sort of the organizational work that is theology as a notional science proper. And so to the degree you can just talk about it in the second sense, whatever, multiple schools, I don't care. I mean, that's basically the whole history of the church, is multiple approaches to what we would call theology. But if you want to do a one-to-one correspondence between dogma and St. Gregory Palamas's thought, sort of on whole, you're going to create an issue, because you've created a category in which you write out other theologies as well, even in an Orthodox world. Because not every Orthodox thinker, like even of the great, like just the great renewal people of the 20th century, were not we're not all Palamites. I think Florovsky is just a good example to use there. It just the idea of sort of the patristic synthesis is not a kind of Palamite project. So just because neo-scholasticism existed in the West didn't mean that sort of neo-Palamitism had to exist in the East the way that it did. So anyway, that's the kind of I'm dancing around a little bit to show sort of the issue there. Like the very way you ask that question kind of can cause issues. I personally just live with it. It's fine. What everything down to the simplicity stuff is actually quite similar to the Thomist school, because the Thomist school among the various Western schools has the thickest concept of grace. It's the most supernatural concept of grace and divine indwelling. But yeah, the simplicity thing is different. I usually just shrug on it because I'm like, the Scotists are different on simplicity. So what am I going to do? But so anyway, yeah, go ahead, Father Deacon then. So how would you respond?
Yeah, that was a great response, Dr. Minard. You know, I read an article years ago about Orthodoxy. I think the author was Father Henry Patrick Reardon, I believe, saying that within Orthodoxy, there are many mansions. He was talking about approaches to theology. What he was saying was that if you look at Orthodoxy historically, there are many different, you know, for lack of a better word, theological schools, right? Mm-hmm. Many different ways of approaching theology. And, you know, Palamism, you know, while there's a certain authority given to aspects of it, ultimately is one way of approaching theology, and other ways have existed in the Eastern Christian world and still exist. What he was kind of bemoaning was how in the past, you know, 50, 60 years, certain Orthodox theological writers have been treated almost like they're the magisterium. And to the point that other viewpoints are dismissed as being, you know, Western or unorthodox. You know what I'm referring to, right? All the people in Parisian school, for example, were treated as being the voice of Orthodox theology, but really just reflects one strand within Orthodox theology. Now, if you go back far enough, you'll find that in some, you know, esteemed Orthodox theological schools in Europe, you know, 150 years ago, they were teaching St. Thomas Aquinas. You know, Thomism wasn't treated like this dirty, awful thing that had no place in the East. There was much more fluidity between Western and Eastern theology than we often admit today. That's why, for example, I would not be ashamed of being a Byzantine Thomist. I don't think there's inherently incompatible. It's not. What I would say is that the tendency to take certain schools and make them, the dogmatic view of Catholicism or of Orthodoxy, because there are people I've encountered who make Thomism Catholic theology. It is the Catholic theology. No, it's not.
Yeah.
I think we have to be willing to acknowledge that ultimately theology is a discipline based in mystery. It's based in mystery. Ultimately, we're looking at mysteries we cannot begin to truly comprehend. We're looking at them from different angles.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many different angles from which we can look at them. And they're all potentially compatible with each other. They're not inherently incompatible. I like to think about what the original meaning of a theologian was in the East. A theologian was a person who had experienced God's light, a person illuminated by God, right? That's what a theologian really is. A person of prayer who has God illuminating their minds, illuminating their hearts and their souls. So this tendency to create theological oppositions between certain schools of theology or, Western versus Eastern theology, I think is deeply unfortunate. And I think it's a tendency to try and highlight our differences and to define ourselves against one another. And I think that's deeply unfortunate.
Jonathan Talks asks, how do you feel about certain Eastern Catholics feeling like they could deny the Filioque or Vatican I? Father Deacon, what do you think?
Yeah, I see that all the time. On one hand, I understand where they're coming from. For a long time in Eastern Catholicism, there was a certain tendency to just mimic all things Western, right? I mean, there was a period of time in which Eastern Catholic churches, by their own initiative, were very, very Latinized. And any kind of traditional Eastern approach to spirituality or theology was shunned. And then it became necessary to move away from that. And Vatican II strongly encouraged the Eastern Catholics to return to their original traditions, their own spirituality, their original theological approaches, to rediscover who we were and to be fully Eastern. And since Vatican II, that's been a big push in Eastern Catholicism, rightfully so. A lot of wonderful things have come from that. Beautiful things have come from that. I'm a strong believer in that project myself. But at the same time, there's a tendency to overcorrect. And some people go too far. And why or how do they go too far? Well, usually it's this. We're called to be examples of Eastern Christianity in communion with Rome. So they begin reading Orthodox books, Orthodox sources, and uncritically accepting everything they're saying as being the Eastern Catholic position. So they pick up a book on Eastern Orthodox theology that says a filioque is heretical, or denies certain Catholic teachings, and they say, well, that's the Orthodox position. That should be the Eastern Catholic position. To be authentically Eastern, I have to hold to the Orthodox position. That's the logic I usually encounter. But what they fail to recognize is this: what often passes as Orthodox theology or the Orthodox position today is a more recent development that came in reaction against Catholicism. If you go back far enough, you can find that every Catholic dogma or doctrine can easily be harmonized with the Eastern Fathers and the Eastern tradition. The problem is when you look at more modern Orthodox writers who were defining things against Catholicism. That's when you fall into this trap. So what I would say to Eastern Catholics who say we are to deny the Filioque or deny Vatican I would say this. If you're in communion with a church, being in communion means we recognize each other as being one. We're different in some ways, but we're also one. Why would you be in communion? Why would you be one with a heretical church that's teaching heresies? You wouldn't. You wouldn't. So as an Eastern Catholic, I don't necessarily have to embrace, the Western dogmas the way they're phrased in the West. But at the same time, as an Eastern Catholic, I have no business declaring them to be heretical or wrong. So when looking at things like Vatican I, the later ecumenical councils, most of them don't have a whole lot of impact on Eastern Catholics, practically speaking. Everyone recognizes that the first, second ecumenical councils have a special position, but at the same time, declaring all later councils to be heretical or false or irrelevant, that's going too far. You can recognize on one hand that they're not that relevant to your lived spirituality as an Eastern Catholic, while at the same time not denying them or claiming that they're false or heretical. Same thing with doctrines like the Filioque, or, Western definitions of faith, you don't necessarily have to embrace them in the sense they become fundamental to how you express the faith, but at the same time, you should recognize that they're a legitimate expression of truth. I'll leave it at that.
I find it interesting that the Eastern Code for Eastern Catholic churches has the exact same obligations of assent for Eastern Catholics in theology as Latin Rite Catholics. In other words, all Catholics, regardless of the church that you're a part of, have the exact same level of assent owed to dogmas, definitive Catholic doctrine, and non-definitive Catholic doctrine.
And it doesn't mean that you have to take it and use it to replace your Eastern expression, but it means at the same time you need to recognize that it's a legitimate expression of truth.
Right. And that's where I think there's room. I think the Eastern Catholic churches can express them in very different ways and have less emphasis on them. But to just outright say, oh, no, I don't have to believe that, I can reject that, it's not even in accord with what your own church says.
At that point, you're saying you're in communion with a church that's teaching heresy.
Yeah, it's just the way
that's not a situation that anyone should be in, right?
It's no wonder why I think people like that tend to leave the Catholic Church and go to Orthodoxy. It's no wonder. So there was somebody. Yeah, go ahead.
Get going.
No problem. No problem. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and call it there. I appreciate both of y'all, joining and doing this, especially at the end of the conference. And thank y'all both also for your contributions. I truly appreciate it. Go ahead and put in a plug for your work, Dr. Miner.
Oh no, we do the plugs other times. No need to plug.
Okay. Anything that you wanted to mention, Father Deacon?
Yeah, I'm still doing the series Becoming Byzantine, and that's with Father Daniel Dozer, Father Michael Wynn, Robert Kleska from EWTN. We're still working on that, and we're recording new episodes. Go on YouTube, type in Becoming Byzantine. Basically, we're walking participants through the Ukrainian Catholic Catechism, Christ or Pascha, and it's really a good introduction to the Byzantine Catholic faith and expression.
Excellent. Once again, thank y'all both for coming on for this Q&A session and also for your contributions to the conference. And everybody hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also check me out, patreon.com/Reason to Theology if you want to support me. And thank you all for participating in the conference and watching. We'll see you later. God bless.